Well, good evening. I am Jim Pierce. I'm the pastor here at the Baker United Methodist Church and the Haynes United Methodist Church. And on behalf of both churches, I want to invite you or welcome you to our John Nilsen concert. He is, I will tell you later where he's going, but he is passing on his way to Idaho. And we are really excited to have him here. There are copies of this Bible on the table out in the foyer if any of you want to take it with you, but I'm going to give you a couple of the highlights of it. He graduated from Southern Oregon University long enough ago that it wasn't Southern Oregon University at the time. And then later he was honored by that institution in 1995 in recognition of his outstanding achievements, dedicated efforts and leadership in the field of the performing arts with the Distinguished Alumnus Award. That is the most prestigious award bestowed upon Southern Oregon University graduates. He is also an accomplished guitarist as well as a pianist, composer, lyricist, and vocalist, and he was selected to be a Yamaha Signature Piano Artist in November 2021. He has performed in all 50 states and 4 continents, and every United Methodist Church in Oregon and Idaho. Is that right?
That is right.
Every single United Methodist Church in the states of Oregon and Idaho. He has been a member of the 10 Grands since its inception in 2001. If you don't know what 10 Grands is, you should Google it. It's really something that happens every year. The last one they had was in May. We'll talk a little bit more about this. If you went to the 10 Grands concert in May, the tickets could be $50 or $100 depending on where you wanted to sit. In 2024, John was inducted into the Oregon Music Hall of Fame. So I present to you John Nilsen.
Good evening. How are you guys?
Good.
It's great to be back in Baker City. It's been a while for me. I think that was about 5 songs, so I'll go back to the start. Let's see, that was the opening song is a song called 12 Shades of Light. That led into a song I wrote about Eastern Oregon. The second song is called Carry the Desert. And I think after that, I might have gone into a little classical song. It was actually, that last thing there is a medley, and there was actually 3 songs in it. The first part of that is a song it's pretty new. I haven't recorded it. The second part of that is called Classical Bicycle, and that has been recorded. And then the last piece, of course, I didn't write, but you know. And it's a great song, What a Wonderful World. I have this list of songs. It must be 10 songs that's never been made into a list. I just know that every now and then one of these songs pops up inside me and I go, oh yeah, that's on that list of 10. It's like the 10 greatest songs I've ever heard. And What a Wonderful World would be one of those 10. And I've never written down the list because it doesn't matter. That's not the point of it. It's just sometimes, you know, when something happens and something bubbles up in you and you remember something you haven't thought of in years, sometimes more, decades. And the same thing happens musically with me all the time. So it's an honor to just get inside that song and play it and be a part of it, you know, because so much of what I do is my own deal. I'm exactly who I want to be musically, and that was really easy for me to make that decision. I grew up in a house where, you know, we had 3 pianos in 1 car. We were the only family in the neighborhood that had that going on. And my mom was a private piano teacher for almost 7 decades. And then my mom gave us, as 4th grade piano students, there must have been about 8 of us, she gave us all an assignment, and that assignment was to compose a song. There are several things in my life that have absolutely changed the course of my life. I believe I knew I would go into music when I was 7 because I heard the Beatles for the first time. And that was enough within that I said, wow, this is really cool. This has got me, and like nothing really has in terms of where are we going, you know. So I thought, yeah, okay, it's going to be music. I had music front and center in this house I grew up in. My family was wonderful. And then in 4th grade, my mom gives us this assignment to write a song. I thought, well, you know, I don't know how to do that. And so she helped us all and showed us, as now I do with kids sometimes in schools as well. And that exercise, that activity, that assignment changed the course of my life. So then I started writing songs regularly in junior high, and it's been composing ever since. So now, you know, you might come out to hear me play, and if I played, you know, 20 songs or 15 songs, you might not recognize any of them. You know, I mean, but you might recognize half of them, and I'll mix it around tonight. But the point of it is that through it all, you begin to learn who you are and where you want to go. And I think that's one of the greatest takeaways that I've ever had in the music business is understanding, you know, who I am, where I'm heading, and what I want to do, what I want to be. It's very personal. It's not just a hobby. And there's just no way I would let someone say, you need to be that. You need to play those songs. Well, no, you need to play what you feel inside. At least that's my perception. Everybody gets to make their own decision. So I did mine, and you know, I found a fork in the road, and I said, great, I'm going to follow the people that I've been inspired by in my life, whether it be the Beatles or Neil Young or you know, even the great classical guys from way back when. I mean, I've had a lot of that in my life, in my upbringing. They were all writing their own music. I said, they're showing me where to go. So I just followed that path. And here I am. In Baker City. But here's another one I didn't write. You guys know that tune? It's a great song. These are two songs I wrote, and the first of which is really a prelude to the second song. First one's called You Are, and this one's recorded. I recorded it with a jazz trio. This sounds so crazy, but you know, when it comes down to being authentic and real, there's nothing that should get in the way of honesty. And it doesn't matter who you are. It should be honesty. That should be front and center for everybody all the time. It's the way I see it. You know, so you might think that this is a really crazy idea, but within this idea is something that's very interesting. And you know, we were recording this trio, so it's myself on piano and an upright bass, and the drummer is playing in more of a jazz style, so he's stirring. Do you know what that means? If he's stirring, he's going on this snare drum. You've seen that, you've heard jazz drummers do it, not hitting like this, like a drummer hits. He's stirring around, and it becomes this textural thing that's very, very cool, very effective when the music's really kind of quiet. And so somebody said in the room in the studio, it's like a bunch of rattlesnakes. And so we started talking. You know, what if we had like 10 snakes and they were, you know, safely over here? Not that you want to get snakes and harass them. Not a good idea. But I mean, we laughed about it. We got a good laugh, and so I'm telling you the honest story now of how that song turned out. Not with snakes, though, with a drum. Anyway, that song, You Are, leads into a different song called Lay It Down. So here we are. country, knowledge that is code for believing. Where you stand, code for the reason, held in hand. There ain't no denying, so many lies written down. dad was a Methodist pastor. And in addition to being a private piano teacher for almost 7 decades, my mom was a music director in a couple churches for almost 50 years. And you know, I grew up in this wonderful household. My parents were pretty traditional, pretty much by the book. And there's a lot of good that comes with that. You know, there's regularity and there's conformity and things that are really well noted and important growing up. It was a great household. I had a wonderful family, great parents. Couldn't have asked for more. We were so middle class it was ridiculous. But my parents worked hard and everything worked out well. They didn't like rock and roll. Not a bit. And you know, my parents were music people, especially my mom. And I learned to really like classical music. And it was on in my house all the time, whether it would be me learning it, someone else learning it and playing it during a lesson, or my mom playing records. And then there were great soundtracks, you know, like West Side Story and Sound of Music, and music that I love. I love that stuff still. It's really well-written music, great music. And yet I couldn't understand that I was just a child. And the Beatles came along and I loved it. And they didn't want anything to do with it. And I didn't quite get that. How does that work? When I like what they're listening to, I'm like, not the Beatles. You know, yes, you can play it, but you've got to keep that volume down. And that's sort of how it rolled in the Nilsen house. And then, you know, I'll tell you what. I bet this was 25 years ago, and my mom came to me and she said, you know, John, do you remember in kindergarten when you colored on the wall with a crayon and you got in trouble? I said, yeah, I do remember that. She said, you know, that wasn't right, and you got in trouble, and that wasn't good. I said, yeah, I know. I'm just glad I didn't do it again. Learned the lesson. And then she said, you know, remember in 3rd grade when you were out on the field at recess, and you and that kid got that little fight, and you got sent home from school that day. Yeah, I really wasn't much of a fighter, but I do remember that. And I guess we were both at fault, and I'm sorry I did that. You know, she says, yeah, you weren't right about that. Then she looked at me, and she said, but you know what? She said, you were right about the Beatles. They are great. I thought that was so cool. there's something about the notes, we call it sustain. The sustain as it begins to go away. It's a very special part of the song, even though the song's over. I was always that guy that if you came over to my house, first of all, I was going to ask you what was your favorite song. We'd be playing and goofing off as kids. Who's your favorite band? What's your favorite song? And they'd say, listen to this. And we'd get to the end of a song on the radio or the record player, and it's going around, and I'd take the volume so I could hear all the way down to the bottom of the fade. Turn it as loud as it goes. That kind of stuff just somehow got to me. Could you remember we all know the Beatles, we've confirmed that. Now, we all know probably the most famous album in rock history, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the next to last song, because that album really has a reprise, which means it starts and ends kind of with the same song, which is Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And the last one, at the very bottom of the record, the last song on side 2 is really short. But right before that is a brilliant tune called A Day in the Life. And there's the London Orchestra on there, and the last chord, I believe, is an E minor. And the orchestra, they keep bowing, and this thing goes on for 45 seconds, and you can turn it all the way up. And at the very bottom of the mix, and the bottom of the fade, some guy hits something like a music stand or something, and someone goes, shh. And my drummer told me this. He's a bigger Beatle fan than me, and I said, no, I've listened to it 100 times. Even backwards I've listened to it. I've never heard that. And so he goes, no, I've got it. So we listened to it, and he had it turned up, and he had a really great stereo, better than mine. And there it is. Yeah, you never know what you're going to hear on that stuff. It's very cool. If my wife was here, she'd say, John, you don't have to tell them all this stuff. They really don't care that much. This song is a song I wrote a couple years ago, and it was just a little bit different. It's just got this... I wrote it to be like a soundtrack in a movie. And it never got a soundtrack, never got to be that. But it had this soundtrack quality, and part of it was that it has this sort of a spooky little character. So if you get to the point where you're not comfortable, just hold hands with somebody. about my family a bit. My wife and I have one daughter. She's a great kid. And we have this one dog. He's a black lab. He stands about that tall. He's got an unusual name, but he's still a great name. Great dog. His name's Buddy. Good dog. It's been fun having Buddy around. And, you know, I think back to my parents, and you know, there's a good chance if you had great parents, they had great parents. That's the way it worked in my family. I loved my grandparents. I only got to know one side of them, but they were wonderful. They lived up in Bellingham. You guys know where that is. Of course, up near Canada. And my grandfather used to take me fishing sometimes. And this one day we were out in the boat, and he said, you know, John, I was about 10 years old at the time. He goes, you know, John, when we go home tonight, I'm going to let you pick out any show you want on television. And I thought, great, you know, because I wasn't up there with my siblings. I was all alone. So, and my grandparents had just got this brand new color TV, and my family didn't have one. I was so excited. And when the time came, it's probably about 7:30 on a Saturday night, 8 o'clock maybe, and my grandfather walked up to the television, turned it on, and then he went through the 3 channels. And on the 3rd channel, I saw a show that I really liked. And I said, that's the show I want to watch. And I could tell immediately my grandfather disapproved. And my grandfather was, you know, someone that you obey. And that was the right call, and yet I said, you know, he told me I could choose my show, so, you know, I wasn't going to go down easy. I said, that's the show I want to watch. It was a show called Shindig.
Oh, yeah.
Remember Shindig? Yeah, you guys. So if you don't remember Shindig, Shindig would have had a band playing rock and roll. Right. The guys in the band probably had long hair. My grandfather's hair came to about here. And they'd be playing, and there'd be some dancing over here. It's one of those sorts of shows. And I loved it. And my grandfather, he's shaking his head. And I said, I want to watch that show. And he says, fishermen don't listen to this kind of music. I didn't know what to do. I just kind of sat there and just hoped he'd go away. And guess what he did? He went into the other room. And my grandmother was in there, and they let me watch the show. You know, I don't even know who the band was. I don't know anything about that, who it was, or what songs they were playing. I know I loved it, but you know, the great takeaway from that is that my grandfather kept his word. That's pretty cool. That was really cool, because I know he didn't dig it. Anyway, I wrote this tune for him. He was a big part of my life, and inspirational in a lot of ways, as was my grandmother. But this is his tune, and this is called Dakota Rose.
going to take a break for just a few minutes so John can crack his knuckles or whatever he needs to do to stay limbered up. I wanted to tell you that tomorrow John is going to be in Idaho, and then Wyoming on Monday and Friday, South Dakota, Nevada, then Washington, and then back in Oregon. He has 34 concerts scheduled between now and the end of the year. Wow. Because he's cutting back. No, he really is cutting back. There was a time when he was doing 240 concerts a year. He does big auditoriums. He does private shows. He does all kinds of incredible performances in Portland and Lake Oswego. And I looked at those on his schedule, and then I went to some of the ticket sites. If you want to go see him in Portland or Lake Oswego, the least expensive ticket that I could find was $47.50. When we talk about that, when he comes to the churches, he only asks for a love offering. And when he and I talked about this, he said, I don't want anybody to not get to come. So when you walk past that love offering box in the back, remember, it could have cost you $47.50 to do this, but he takes a love offering to pay for his gas and his hotel room and things like that. But that's all he asked for. I offered to let him stay in the basement at the parsonage. She said, no, that's fine. So we're going to, are you warmed up back there, livered up? You ready? Ready to go ball game.
song. Yeah. It's a lovely song. I played in Memphis a lot of times and got to go to Graceland, which was pretty interesting, really interesting. And also the Gibson Guitar Factory's there. I think there's like maybe 3 of them. And that was the one for semi-hollow bodies, ES335, if you know anything about guitars. That was fascinating to me. But yeah, love that song by Elvis. And love you guys too. Thank you for being here tonight. It was really, really great to get back to Baker City. And I'm most grateful that you guys were a part of this. Most grateful to the church and to Jim, and to Lisa and everybody else, all of you that played a hand in this that I'm not unaware of. Thank you all. And wish you the best of the rest of the year. And I'll wrap it up with one more tune. Don't know what I'm going to play yet, but I've got about 5 seconds to figure it out. Bless you guys. Thank you.
Would you like to hear a little more music from John? Well, that's great because there's a table back there that is just full of CDs. And you can get a couple of those CDs and you can listen to John all that you want. We also have some snacks back there and coffee and all kinds of fun stuff. We invite you to look at the CDs and visit with everybody and have a few snacks. Thank you for coming.